Okay, hello everyone, and thank you, Colette. Thank you to the Sign Design Society for inviting me, and thank you all for joining us. Here is a brief overview of what I will talk about today. I will start with an introduction of myself, my practice. Next, I will introduce my thesis and give you some context about how I got started with that. Then I will discuss 3 chapters from the thesis and show you some of the experimental works I created, and we will finish with questions. My name is Jaap Knevel. I'm an independent wayfinding designer from the Netherlands, working under the name of Tokyo Monorail. As I said, we will have time for questions at the end, but if you're watching this from the archives, as I often do, or you have anything else you would like to share with me, you're most welcome to email me or send me a message on LinkedIn. I've been working as a wayfinding designer since 2015 when I graduated from Design Academy Eindhoven and started working at Meixenaar. One of my assignments as a trainee was to draw these pictograms for bicycle parking in Amsterdam, which I worked on together with creative director Rijke Boerma, who joined us today also. Unbeknown to me at the time, they would eventually become somewhat of a national standard and can now be found pretty much all over the country, which I'm very thrilled about. After a few years, I set up my own practice, seeking out projects that deal specifically with multiculturalism and multilingualism. Shown here on the left is a sketch that was part of an assignment I worked on for Brussels Airport, together with Jorn Kraaks, a Belgian behavior designer. Together, we proposed changes to the wayfinding system at the airport whilst maintaining the unique complexity of the 4 languages they use side by side, which is the norm for official communication in Belgium. And on the right-hand side, you can see part of a trilingual subway diagram of Seoul, an unofficial diagram, I should say, which I've been working on recently to practice with laying out non-Latin languages. Next to my design practice, I also develop and teach workshops for various design schools. For example, I will ask students to take walks through the city without any plan and observe which features in their environment they naturally use to navigate. They then translate those observations into a working wayfinding tool. One of my students, who grew up in a mountainous region of Italy, observed that she was constantly looking upwards because she was used to navigating herself using mountains. And for her tool, she created this transparent guide, which teaches people how to use the tops of buildings to judge the quality of a restaurant, which I thought was really clever. This summer, I completed my master's degree at the Department of Visual Communication at Konstfack in Stockholm, Sweden. My graduation project consisted of 2 parts. The first part is a thesis called "There Must Be Other Ways," a personal plea for more complexity, dialogue, and otherness in wayfinding design. The second part is an exhibition that displays my visual experiments. As a visitor, you would enter the gallery space and see a collection of signs, pictograms, and maps. And I'll talk about each of those works you see on the wall in more detail. But first, this sentence. My research started 2 years ago with a realization that I had changed my mind. I realized that through my education, my time at Meixenaar, and my time as an independent designer, my views on wayfinding design have undergone quite a radical shift and have prompted me to reconsider my relationship with the practice. When I talk about wayfinding design, I talk about a series of projects that I fell in love with long ago. Projects such as the 1964 Tokyo Olympic pictograms, the 1965 redesign of the UK's road signs, and the World Exhibition of 1967 in Montreal, Canada. Those large-scale projects, designed with international audiences in mind, required a new approach to graphic design that combined modernist aesthetics with industrial standardization. They also led to the creation of associations and conferences, which allowed designers to collaborate internationally. Many of these early projects would later become synonymous with wayfinding design as a whole. And I would argue their methodologies and aesthetics remain the norm to this day. Inspired by those projects, I moved to Amsterdam in pursuit of becoming a professional wayfinding designer myself. But after a few years, I started to feel trapped between two different realities. One of those realities took place inside the design studio. The other took place on the streets of Amsterdam, where I walked almost every night after work. Inside the design studio, the world was simple and rational. Nearly every project used the same neutral grids, the same timeless sans serif typefaces, and the same effective colors. Diversity in wayfinding design, I was taught, was something to be avoided. Outside the studio, however, I found a completely different world. The absolute chaos of one of the world's most multicultural cities, Amsterdam, with countless languages and countless styles everywhere I looked. Here, diversity was something to be celebrated. This is where my doubt really started. I started looking for other ways of working that better represented the diversity I was surrounded by. In Geneva, Switzerland, I discovered that the mayor there had decided to ditch the standardized pictograms for pedestrian crossings. Instead of the figures we all know, which most people read as male, by the way, Geneva introduced a series of 6 different pictograms, each featuring different bodies, and randomized them throughout the city. In the north of Japan, I found an airport which features 7 different languages on its signs. 7 different languages. I had never seen such a thing. I wrote Koyama Keiichi-san of iDesign, the studio in Tokyo, who designed the signs, and he replied very kindly to me, explaining that including the languages was part of an attempt to promote tourism in the region. And I learned that something as fundamental as navigating public transportation can be difficult and even dangerous for women, something I, as a man, rarely questioned. If you haven't seen it yet, I highly recommend watching a previous SDS talk on this topic, which was titled, How Can Wayfinding Design and Environmental Graphics Help Make the Built Environment Safer Against Gender-Based Violence? And you can find it in the talk's archive. Looking back at these experiences from my new home in Stockholm led me to this question. What are the creative norms in wayfinding design? And what can I learn from the people who challenge them? I want to discuss 3 of these norms, which I identified in my thesis: standardization, simplification, and globalization. For each of them, I will talk about their origins, introduce some of the people who challenged them, and show how I incorporated them into my practice through a series of experiments. And to make them more specific for each of them, I used a different medium: pictograms, signs, and maps. 1. Standardization. Creating international standards for pictograms has major economic, read capitalist, benefits, as it allows for mass production. Another clear benefit is safety. International agreements of pictograms for fire hazards, for example, make it much easier for people in unfamiliar environments to guide themselves to safety. In the same period that saw the rise of standardization in wayfinding design, a group of designers elevated the idea to a utopian ideology. They imagined pictograms as a new global language that could be used by everyone as a lingua franca, or even as the world's only language. This example you see is a pictographic language called Locos, designed in 1964 by Yukio Ota, who was also involved in creating the fire exit sign. One of the most successful standards for pictograms are the DOT symbol signs, especially when looking at their drawing style. Shapes are highly geometrical and almost always filled. Women and men prefer traditional gender roles, and figures of men are the default. And depictions of people with disabilities are limited to a man sitting in a wheelchair. Go anywhere in the world and you will find them. American graphic designers Alan Lupton and Jaap Miller called this the, quote, hegemonic relationship between the officially sanctioned language of internationalism and the specific cultural contexts which they inhabit, end of quote. Local variations of pictograms in large public spaces were replaced by international standards, who became increasingly dominant, creating a visual landscape that is pretty much devoid of any local style. But there are other ways. This is a small selection of the incredible work of Auperlu Grébin, a young designer from Ivory Coast. With the help of YouTube tutorials, he created Zuzukwa, a growing series of emoji-like symbols that represent local Ivory Coast and West African cultural symbols. Not only does the project break with the extremely limited nature of international pictograms, it also challenges the stereotypical and negative narratives within and about the African continent. Another attempt to add diversity to pictograms is the work of then 16-year-old Rayouf Ahmedi. With the help of an initiative called Emoji Nation, she was able to submit her proposal for an emoji of a woman with a hijab to Unicode, the international organization that governs emojis. In an interview with CNN, she said, quote, "I just wanted an emoji of me," end of quote, highlighting the importance of representation in the design of pictograms. And the success of these untraditional initiatives isn't limited to just emojis. It also challenges seemingly unchangeable international symbols. In 2009, the Accessible Icon Project, a grassroots initiative from Massachusetts, United States, successfully led to the legislation of a new wheelchair symbol. Initiated by artists Brian Glennie and Sarah Hendren, the campaign embraced unorthodox tactics, such as get-togethers, where people spray painted the new symbol over existing symbols using paper stencils. These approaches, rejecting international standards in favor of local initiatives or extending existing series of pictograms to make them more diverse, became the starting point for my own experiments. Together with the Dutch advocacy group Stichting Onbeperkt Genieten, which roughly translates to Foundation for Unlimited Enjoyment, I collaborated on a series of new accessibility pictograms. Onbeperkt Genieten works with many large museums and cultural institutions in the Netherlands to promote better access for people that are sensitive to high sensory environments, such as rooms with bright lights or sudden noises. One of the ways they had been wanting to achieve that is by creating a pictogram, which they called the prikkel pictogram, or sensory pictogram. Using a kind of speedometer or barometer, this new symbol indicated the level of sensory load for a room or a location to help people better navigate cultural events and also to raise awareness about these kinds of disabilities. We started our collaboration by redrawing the sensory pictogram based on the concept of a barometer that they had been using for different kinds of intensities, as I said. But we also created a series of additional pictograms, each indicating a different kind of sensory load one might encounter. Based on the discussions we had together with feedback we got from museums, we also created instructions about how to use these pictograms, displaying them on a map, for instance, that can be requested at a reception, inspired by the various maps Transport for London issues for people with disabilities navigating the tube. This dialogical way of working together with the community presented surprising challenges for me. For example, when put to the community for feedback, a majority of people chose to include human figures in the pictograms. Even though I myself had tried to avoid this, I wanted to challenge the assumptions but the community wanted something familiar. I strongly believe, though, that giving the community the final say, which is what we did, was the right thing to do, as these pictograms serve to represent them, not me, and represent their experiences, not mine. Finally, we published the complete series under a Creative Commons license for anyone to pick up and trial. Several large museums have already signaled their interest, and some are currently already testing them. So I don't have much to show you yet about their implementation, but I am really excited to see how we can further improve them going forward. 2, simplification. Simplification is the process of making something simple, from the Latin word simplus, meaning something which is made out of a single ingredient instead of many. In the context of wayfinding design, that always involves some kind of a transformation from a situation that is considered not simple, made of many ingredients to follow the definition, to a situation which is. Simplification is therefore always a production or a process of reduction of visual information. And like the process of standardization I discussed in the previous chapter, simplification in signage is closely connected to the economics of manufacturing. Reducing the number of parts makes the manufacturing process easier and faster. A small sign with one destination in one language costs less to manufacture than a big sign with 3 destinations in 3 languages. Besides the economies of scale, simplification also has proven benefits when it comes to the comprehension of wayfinding signs. The magical number 7 plus or minus 2, a paper from the 1950s, states that the average number of things humans can store in their short-term memory is about 7 plus or minus 1. Putting that into practice means that reducing the number of destinations or languages on a sign can often prove to be a good strategy. Otto Eicher, the famous graphic designer, combined his belief in simplification with the dream I talked about earlier of a world where everyone navigates using a pictographic language. He predicted that by the year 2000, there wouldn't be any words on signs at all anymore. Others believed and hoped everyone would soon speak English, making the need for other languages on signs redundant and allowing them to be even simpler. The cultural significance of language on signage, however, is rarely taken into consideration. I spoke to sign artist Thomas Kolbengtsson about his work, Land Protector. Land Protector is a Swedish border sign he made with the text Sapmi written on it, one of the names the indigenous Sami people use for their land, which is now spread across Norway, Sweden, Finland, and Russia. For decades, Sweden oppressed these communities and refused to recognize their languages. By reclaiming the official icon of a border sign, Thomas highlights the unique power signage has to give official names and also to oppress other names. Similarly, in Aotearoa, the country Dutch colonizers named New Zealand, indigenous Maori communities are fighting for visual revitalization of their language on road signs. Porirua, a town on the North Island, started adopting new bilingual road signs in 2017. And together with other towns, they are part of a much larger movement to make all road signs in the country bilingual. Language and culture cannot be separated. Simplifying the complexity doesn't work here because the complexity is precisely what makes it diverse. In my experiments, I wanted to find the limit of language representation. And I want to show you 2 signs that I made for the exhibition. First, inspired by the Sami road sign, I created a speculative multilingual version of the two station entrance signs you see in this photo. Together, they mark the main entrance to the central station of Stockholm's metro and commuter rail network, and feature the names of the two stations, T-Centralen for the metro station and Stockholm City for the commuter rail station. Both names, like most signs in Stockholm, are written in Swedish with the only addition of English. The two pictures are, by the way, not two different locations, but I took two pictures because the sign is too big to fit on my phone. I chose this sign not only because it's the main entrance to the busiest station on the network, but because Sergels Torg, the square in front of the entrance, is a major physical platform for social and political protest. If you look closely in the top right of the photo, you can see the station entrance. As my protest, I added all 12 written languages with an officially recognized status in Sweden: Swedish, Finnish, Menkali, Yiddish, North Sami, Lule Sami, South Sami, and 5 versions of Romani. Rather than removing languages from signs or replacing them with pictograms in an attempt to make them easier to understand, cheaper to make, or just more aesthetically pleasing, I want to use my sign as a tool for language inclusion and language protection. To accommodate all the languages typographically, I extended the official typeface used by Stockholm's public transport agency. This meant adapting existing characters used in the Sami and Romani place names and creating new characters for the Hebrew script used for writing Yiddish. Daniel Grumer, an Israeli multilingual type designer based in Tel Aviv, kindly agreed to give me feedback on the Hebrew letter forms so that they fit in with the overall family. For the exhibition, I had the signs printed in true scale on outdoor banner material. By doing this, I tried to use the visual language of protest signs whilst retaining the specifications of wayfinding signs. Here's a close-up. In my second experiment, I wanted to push far beyond 12 languages on signs. Staying at Stockholm's central station, I created a new multilingual version of this escalator sign. For context, this sign hangs above every escalator in every metro station in Stockholm and indicates the direction of the escalator. I translated the word up into 20 different languages and extended the dot matrix font into all scripts used by those languages. I chose these 20 languages as they are the most commonly spoken in Sweden. What's interesting about this list is that it is very different from the list of officially recognized languages. Arabic, for instance, which has no official recognition, despite it being very common and is considered the second most spoken language in the country. Like the original, I also animated the sign. And because it is a digital sign, the number of languages it can display is virtually unlimited. It doesn't cost anything more to include more languages. The sign doesn't have to be made bigger, and because the arrows are constantly visible, it doesn't even hurt legibility. Typographically, this again proved to be a huge challenge, and I couldn't have done it without the help of many native speakers who volunteered. They provided valuable feedback on the shape and the spacing of letters, something which I could have never judged for myself. I also received generous feedback from Göran Söderström and his studio Letters from Sweden, a local type design studio in Stockholm. At the exhibition, both designs generated a lot of reactions. And I especially remember talking to a Turkish-Swedish member of the cleaning staff at the gallery, who told me how surprised and how proud she was to see her mother tongue, Turkish, represented in this environment. Chapter 3, Globalisation. There is a myth in wayfinding design, which I was taught during my training, and it goes something like this. If all airports, streets, museums in the world would use our wayfinding signs, you would only have to learn the system once, and then you could navigate anywhere in the world. Imagine a traveler arriving at an airport in Brazil after flying there from the Netherlands. They would already know how to navigate. Wouldn't that be great? This cookie cutter approach, as I call it, ultimately envisions a globalized culture in which you can travel from the other side of the world to another side of the world without having to learn anything new about navigating the local environment. When I started working in wayfinding design, I was completely captivated by this idea. I loved it. It gave me almost limitless ambition because the whole world was now available to me to work in. And with tools that automate the making of signs and the worldwide availability of products like Google Maps, this vision felt closer than ever. But through discussions with classmates at Konstfack, I realized putting the same wayfinding signs all over the world to allow for universal navigation holds a dark reminder of the past. When the Netherlands was a colonial nation, we didn't just map the territories we violently occupied. We built entire cities there, copied from the plans of our cities. Jakarta, now the capital of Indonesia, holds the remains of a city we called Batavia, the capital of the Dutch East Indies colony in the 17th century. We built a city called New Amsterdam on the east coast of what is now the United States of America. We built a city called Willemstad on the island of Curaçao in the Caribbean. All of these were modeled after Dutch cities, which made navigation easy and convenient, but for the colonial inhabitants. In April of 2022, I had a conversation with Anthony Lopez, who I mentioned earlier, a designer in New Delhi and principal at Lopez Design. We talked about the effects colonization and globalization had on wayfinding design. It left me with a deep impression. The entire ecosystem follows the West, he said, referring to the reliance on Western graphic standards in wayfinding design. It is the West who decides what is good and what is bad design. The process of unlearning those graphic standards starts with the recognition that they erased and replaced unique forms of graphic design which existed before. Lopez Design's work, like this new symbol for gender-neutral toilets, tries to restart the process of creating something unique and something truly Indian. New York is good for New York. Copenhagen is good for Copenhagen. It's not good for us. Another project I want to show, which incorporates this replacing of Western standards through mapping, is a project called Coming Home to Indigenous Place Names in Canada. It is a map that documents place names that Indigenous communities gave to them before the colonial occupation of present-day Canada. Next to the original names are literal translations of those names in English to understand their context. For instance, a place name I don't know how to pronounce, but I'm going to try. Amisk Sakikan translates to Beaver Lake. For my experiments, I wanted to explore moving as far away as possible from the universal and the global into the personal and the emotional. I wanted to stop talking about how people navigate and instead work from a different question. How does one navigate? What do different individuals see when they move through a city? What do different individuals feel when they move through a city? Not as a practical way of researching to get statistics or something about how individuals navigate, but rather to challenge my gaze and to explore how the medium of maps can be used to represent otherness. I found inspiration in poetry, like this work of Georges Perec, an attempt at exhausting a place in Paris, in which he sits at a cafe for 3 days and writes down everything he notices outside. A 63, a postal van, a child with a dog, a man with a newspaper, a man with a large A on his sweater. I also look back at my experiences with teaching, and referring back to the workshop I showed you in the beginning, I started asking people in Stockholm to go for a walk and to bring me with them. On a route of their choice, anywhere in the city, I asked them to think out loud about what they noticed in their surroundings and what kind of features they used to navigate. Walking, listening to people's observations, and taking notes about those observations removed me instantly from the strict guidelines I think of when I make signage, and instead put me right into the minds of the people I walked with. After the walk, I would visualize my notes, and they almost naturally became poetry themselves. Number 3, Åsögatan. Who should I be in that place? Up there is a hard rock gym, bearded guys working out in Motorhead t-shirts. With the blue hair, you pass as one of them. Here's a good pool hall. They have a nacho buffet. You wouldn't feel safe there going alone, but it's a good place to experiment, stepping into a role, imagining being a man. This is the poem in full. And the line at the center is a geographic line of the walk we took through the city. I made the poems foldable, referring to the visual language of roadmaps. And one poem soon became a series of poems, and I called them Other Images of the City. Each one of them documents one individual and shares thoughts about how they find their way. The only thing I kept as a template is the geographic line that shows the route we took. Here's another one, which is about someone navigating a place through a memory of another place, creating a second line that intersects at the point of recollection. 2, Cow Hill, Fort William. Reminds you of that hill in Scotland. It was raining that day. You were thinking of the times you tried to run away from home. To conclude this part of the project, I performed some of the poems at the Museum of Modern Art in Stockholm. As I walked off stage into a room full of strangers who had just applauded me for reading poetry about wayfinding design, I couldn't help but be moved. I knew instinctively that this moment marked a new beginning for me and my practice. I was no longer in doubt. This was what I had been searching for. Closing words. If there's something I learned in this research project, is that pictograms, signs, and maps are cultural objects first, and only functional objects second. They keep in them ideologies about who we include in public spaces, which languages we deem official, and whose ways of navigation we represent. Viewing wayfinding signs as mere economic objects, as somehow universal, fails to recognize what I have come to consider their most important responsibility: to be good citizens of the visual culture they are situated in. Wayfinding design is a deeply social practice. And, pun intended, I hope you will all follow me in moving the practice in that direction. Thank you. Dank je wel. Tak.